When my son told me, "Dad, I don't need your advice. I know business," I stayed silent. 1 month later, he lost every dollar he had and came begging for help. That night, his phone lit up. $100,000 deposited. Unknown sender, Dad. What he didn't know was that the money wasn't a gift. It was a test. Before we start the story, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. My name is Calder, and at 66, I had learned that silence teaches lessons louder than any words could. I had built my life around discipline, saving each dollar like it might vanish overnight. Years of managing a small construction business had taught me what risk looked like and what overconfidence could destroy. My son, Neil, didn't believe that. He said I saw the world in black and white, that I never took chances. He said business today was about bold moves, not patience. I had smiled at that. Youth always thought wisdom was fear in disguise. It started one evening in my kitchen. Neil leaned back in his chair, waving his phone like a trophy. He had found a new investment course online, something about trading digital assets and flipping startups. "Dad," he said, his voice full of that sharp confidence only a 20-something could have, "I don't need your advice. I know business." He laughed when he said it, but the way his eyes flickered told me it wasn't just a joke. He truly believed it. I felt the sting of those words, but I swallowed it. I had said similar things to my father once. I remembered how wrong I'd been then, and I knew life would teach Neil better than I ever could. A month passed, like a storm. Neil stopped visiting as often. When he did, his phone was glued to his hand, charts flashing, numbers climbing and crashing in quick rhythm. I would hear bits of conversations about profits, investors, big opportunities. He talked faster every week, as if speed itself was proof of progress. Then one night, he came by again, but this time there was no phone in his hand. His voice was smaller, thinner. "Dad, I need a little help," he said. "Just a loan." Everything went south at once. The market turned. The supplier backed out. "I can fix it. I just need time." I looked at him quietly. His eyes were swollen, his hair unkempt, his confidence gone. I thought of all the times he brushed off my advice, all the warnings I had tried to give him. But more than anger, I felt tired. I said only 4 words. "I'll think about it." He blinked, maybe surprised I hadn't scolded him or offered instant comfort. He nodded slowly, then left. I watched him walk to his car, shoulders slumped, and I knew this moment would stay with him longer than any speech ever could. That night, I sat at my old wooden desk, the same one where I had signed every contract, counted every dollar, balanced every loss. On the top drawer lay a checkbook, faded from years of use. I opened it, wrote down a number, then paused. I tore the check in half. It wasn't time for charity. He needed something stronger, a reminder, not a rescue. I logged into my bank account and created a new transfer profile with no name, only a phrase. "Unknown sender, Dad." I typed in the amount, $100,000. The exact sum I knew would change his life again, but this time only if he used it right. When I clicked to confirm, I felt a strange calm. I wasn't rewarding failure. I was testing character. Neil had chosen pride once. Now I would see what he chose with power. At midnight, as the transaction processed, I imagined his phone lighting up on his nightstand. The same device that had shown him imaginary profits a month ago would now show him something real. A gift or a challenge. It depended on him. I leaned back, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. My hands were steady, my heart even. Tomorrow would bring noise, confusion, maybe anger. But tonight, there was only quiet truth. Sometimes, the hardest help a father can give is the kind that doesn't come with explanations. Neil's phone must have lit up exactly at midnight, because by morning, I already had 3 missed calls from him. The messages he left sounded like two different people fighting inside one voice. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a kind of quiet shock. Dad, someone sent me money. $100,000. It says, unknown sender, Dad. Did you do this? He asked in one message, then paused before adding, if you did, thank you. I won't waste it this time. I swear. I didn't reply. I wanted his thoughts to echo for a while before I gave them walls to bounce off. Later that morning, I went about my day like nothing had changed. I fixed the fence, made coffee, read the newspaper, but my mind was steady on him. I wondered what he was doing at that moment, if he was already spending the money, or if he was sitting at his desk, staring at the screen, wondering why it came with no instructions. I hoped it was the second. Sometimes mystery makes a man slower, more thoughtful. By afternoon, he showed up at my house without warning. He didn't knock. He just stood at the door like someone half afraid to enter his own story. Dad, he said carefully, why would you do that? You didn't even ask me what went wrong. I looked at him, really looked this time. The same boy who used to take things apart just to see how they worked, now looked like he'd been taken apart himself. You said you knew business, I told him quietly. So treat this like one. Make it work, he frowned. You don't want to know where it went before? No, I said. I already know. That silence sat heavy between us. He waited for anger or advice, but I had none to give. I wasn't going to hold his hand through another mistake. I had seen men in my generation ruin their sons by giving too much too soon. Love turned into dependency, guidance into control. I refused to repeat that pattern. He stood there, staring at me, like waiting for a map that wasn't coming. Finally, he muttered, I'll prove it's not wasted, and walked out. 2 days passed. No calls, no messages, only that strange stillness that happens before something breaks. Then, late on the third night, a message arrived. Dad, I think I figured it out. This time I'm going to build something solid. You'll see. I didn't answer. Not yet. Weeks moved like clouds, slow but full of change. I heard from a mutual friend that Neil had rented a small office space downtown. He wasn't chasing flashy investors anymore. He had started selling refurbished tech equipment, something steady, something real. I wanted to be proud, but part of me stayed cautious. Money changes people, but so does failure. Sometimes it teaches the wrong lessons first. Then one afternoon, I got a message from the bank. Not a deposit, not a withdrawal, an alert. The account from which the $100,000 had been sent was now being used for purchases marked as business assets. No red flags, no random transfers. That was a good sign. Still, I didn't call. Patience had become my sharpest tool. But the peace didn't last long. A week later, my phone buzzed again, this time not with a message from Neil, but from an unknown number. Attached was a single photo. It was Neil standing in front of his new store sign. He looked proud, but behind that smile, there was something unsettled. I zoomed in on the image and saw what bothered me. The sign above his shop didn't say his own name. It had someone else's printed on it, someone I didn't know. The caption below the photo read, New beginnings, big things ahead. That was the first time I felt the same chill I'd felt the night he'd said, I know business. Some lessons, it seemed, still hadn't finished teaching him. I didn't sleep that night. The image of that store sign kept circling my thoughts. It wasn't jealousy or suspicion. It was instinct. Years of running my own business had taught me that the name on the door always tells a story. If it isn't yours, it means someone else is holding the strings. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to call him directly, not yet. I just needed to understand what game he had stepped into this time. 2 days later, I drove downtown and parked across the street from the store. The sign above the door read, Venture Tech Solutions in bright blue letters. Beneath it, a smaller gold plate displayed another name, in partnership with Darius Kellen. I didn't know the man, but I didn't like that title. Partnership. It usually meant someone was giving orders while the other provided cash. Through the window, I saw Neil talking to a tall, well-dressed man with slicked back hair. They were shaking hands, both smiling, but only one smile reached the eyes, and it wasn't my son's. The stranger's grin was wide and easy, practiced. Neil looked tense, almost forced. I stayed in the car, watching them for a while, then drove away. There was no point in confronting him. He had to see the truth on his own. A week later, I got another message from Neil. It was short. Business is growing. Thanks again, Dad. I'll pay you back soon. That one line made me uneasy. Growth too fast is just as dangerous as loss. I wanted to tell him that, but I knew it would fall on deaf ears again. So I simply replied, "Keep your eyes open." Days passed quietly until one night I received another call. It was past midnight, the hour when nothing good ever happens. His voice on the line was trembling. "Dad, Darius wants to change the terms. He says I owe him a percentage for the investment, but it was my money. He said he brought the connections. I didn't sign anything, but now he's threatening to take the store name if I don't agree." I could hear panic underneath his words, the same kind of fear I had once heard in men who trusted the wrong partners. "Did you use any of the money for personal spending?" I asked softly. "No, I used it all for the business." "And did you ever check who Darius really is?" I said. He went quiet. I trusted him. That sentence landed like a weight on my chest. Trust without proof is a blindfold. I had worn that same one once, years ago, when I invested everything I had into a man who promised to expand my company and left me with debts instead. It had taken me 10 years to recover. I thought I'd buried that part of my life, but now it had returned, wearing my son's face. "Don't talk to him until I look into this," I told him. "Send me his full name, company records, everything you've got." He hesitated, then agreed. When I hung up, I sat in the dark, staring at the wall. My hands were trembling, not from anger, but from memory. The next morning, I went through every record I could find. It didn't take long. Darius Kellen was slick indeed. 3 bankrupt businesses, each ending with lawsuits or unpaid partners. He'd been banned from one state for fraud. The man was a ghost in a nice suit. I printed everything, page by page, and set it in a folder. I didn't know how deep Neil was in yet, but I knew one thing for certain. He was about to learn that sometimes losing money isn't the worst thing. Losing trust is. The next morning, I drove straight to Neil's place. He opened the door looking like he hadn't slept for days. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "I didn't think he'd do this, Dad. He said he was helping me build connections." He ran his hand through his hair, pacing back and forth like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Papers were scattered all over his table, contracts, invoices, payment slips, most of them half-signed. I noticed a letter from a supplier demanding payment. I placed the folder I brought on the table. "You need to read this." He looked at me, then slowly opened it. As he scanned through the pages, his breathing changed. I watched realization hit him like a slow punch. Each paragraph showing another lie, another face Darius had worn before vanishing with someone else's money. Neil sank into a chair, whispering, "He used me." I nodded. "He's used many people. The difference is you still have a chance to stop him before he takes everything." He rubbed his face, frustration spilling out in short bursts. I thought I was being smart. He said he'd help with distribution, that he had clients lined up. I trusted him, Dad. I signed an agreement, but I didn't read it fully. I took a deep breath. "Show me the document." He pulled out a folder and handed it over. One glance was enough to know the damage. Darius had written himself as co-owner, with a clause that allowed him to withdraw profits and assets any time. Neil had basically handed him the business. He buried his head in his hands. "What do I do now?" "You fight back," I said calmly, "but you do it with patience, not panic. First, freeze all outgoing payments. Then gather every receipt, email, and message. We'll build proof. And remember, don't confront him yet. He nodded weakly. You're not angry? I was, I said. But anger doesn't solve anything. You don't need my anger. You need my experience. That seemed to quiet him for a moment. I could see in his eyes that this wasn't just about money anymore. He had finally reached the point where pride turns into humility, the kind of humility that hurts, but heals afterward. Over the next few days, I helped him piece everything together. We visited the bank, notified them of potential fraud, and contacted a lawyer I'd known for years. Each step was heavy for him. He hated admitting how careless he'd been, but he followed every instruction. I watched him learn responsibility, one painful document at a time. Then one afternoon, he received a call while I was at his office. His tone changed instantly. Yes, Darius, I know. No, I didn't block your access. Bank's policy. Nothing personal. He hung up, his hand shaking. He's angry, Dad. He said I'll regret making him look stupid. Good, I said. That means he's cornered. People like him don't handle control slipping away. For the first time in weeks, Neil smiled faintly. It wasn't confidence. It was relief. The kind that comes when someone finally stops running and starts standing their ground. But just as I thought the storm was calming, another one began brewing. That evening, a message came to my phone from an unknown number. It was short and cold. You're teaching your son bad habits. Stay out of. This old man. No signature, but I didn't need one. Darius had just made his first mistake, sending a threat to someone who'd already survived worse. I deleted the message, then looked out the window at the fading sunset. The game had changed, and this time I was part of it. The following day, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun wasn't even up yet, and the air outside had that quiet chill before dawn. I sat by the window with a cup of black coffee, reading that message in my mind again. Stay out of this, old man. It was almost funny. Darius didn't know he'd just warned the wrong person. I'd seen men like him my whole life, sharp talkers with no spine once the walls started closing in. They called it business. I called it gambling with other people's trust. By the time the sky turned gray, I was already outside Neil's office. He arrived soon after, surprised to see me waiting by the door. You couldn't sleep either? He asked. No, I said, and I got a message last night. His face went pale. From Darius? Yes, don't worry. He's nervous, not dangerous. Nervous men make mistakes, and we're going to let him make a big one. We spent the morning collecting every shred of proof. Emails, payment records, screenshots of his messages. Everything that showed how Darius had twisted his way into Neil's business. The lawyer helped us draft a notice to freeze all transactions under the company's name. Then we submitted a fraud report. It was all slow, careful work. No shouting, no threats, just quiet steps that build pressure. Around noon, Neil got another call. He put it on speaker this time. Darius's voice was slick and calm, the way a snake might sound if it could talk. You're overreacting, my friend. All this legal drama isn't good for your image. You think your father's experience can protect you from reality? You'll lose everything if you go against me. Neil's voice didn't shake this time. Then I guess I'll lose it with my name still on it. He hung up before Darius could respond. I saw something new in his eyes. Resolve. It was the first time I'd seen him speak without doubt. He didn't look like a lost kid anymore. He looked like a man trying to earn back his own respect. Later that evening, I went home feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, pride mixed with worry. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, I knew Darius wouldn't back off that easily. People like him didn't know when to quit. 2 days later, I got another call. This time, it wasn't from Neil or the lawyer. It was from the bank. The voice on the other end sounded cautious. Mr. Calder, there's been an attempt to withdraw a large amount, $50,000 from your transfer account. It was flagged as suspicious and blocked automatically. Do you know a Darius Kellen? For a moment, everything went still. My chest tightened. That account was the same one I had. Used to send Neil the money. Somehow, Darius had tried to access it, My silence must have sounded strange because the banker repeated the question. Sir, do you know him? Yes, I said slowly, and you were right to block it. Keep it locked until I come in tomorrow. After hanging up, I sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the clock. Darius had gone too far this time. It wasn't about Neil anymore. It was about me. He had tried to reach into my pocket, and that made it personal. When Neil called later that night, his voice was tense. Dad, Darius hasn't shown up to the office in 2 days. He stopped answering calls. I think he knows we're closing in. He's not hiding, I said quietly. He's busy trying to find another way out. Neil paused. What do you mean? I leaned back in my chair. He just tried to steal from me, but he failed, and now he's desperate. There was silence on the line. What do we do now? He asked finally. I looked out the window at the dark sky. Now, I said, we wait, and when he makes his next move, we'll be ready. What I didn't tell Neil then was that I already had my next step planned. I wasn't going to let Darius slip away like he had before with other people. This time, he was about to learn that age doesn't mean weakness, and that patience, when pushed too far, can become the sharpest weapon of all. The next few days passed with a heavy silence. Neil and I stayed in touch constantly, but both of us knew something was coming. Darius was the kind of man who wouldn't disappear quietly. When a thief fails to steal once, he always looks for another door. On the 4th morning, I got a message from Neil that made my stomach turn. Dad, someone broke into the store last night. The computers are gone, and the files too. I didn't even text back. I just grabbed my jacket and drove. When I reached the shop, the doorframe was splintered, glass scattered like frost on the floor. The police were already there, taking notes, while Neil tried to explain what little he knew. I looked around. No cash stolen, no random damage. Whoever did it wanted something specific. My guess was the business contracts. One officer asked Neil if he had any suspects. He said no, but his eyes met mine for a split second. We both knew. After the officers left, Neil sat down on a stool amid the mess. Dad, I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice breaking. I tried to be smart, to prove I could handle things, but it's like everything I touch turns to trouble. I sat beside him. It's not what you touch, I said quietly. It's who you trust. He looked at me, tears starting to form. You think this is him? I don't think, I said. I know. I told him that I had already checked Darius's past records. He had done this before. When evidence piled up, he'd break into his partner's offices, wipe out documents, and vanish. I could almost see the gears turning in Neil's head as the realization hit him that this wasn't just business anymore. It was war. That evening, after helping him board up the broken door, I went home and called an old friend of mine who had retired from the police force but still had connections. I told him everything, including the message Darius had sent me. You've got enough for a case, he said after a pause. If you can find him, we can act fast. 2 nights later, the call came. We've got him, my friend said. He tried to open an account under a new name at a bank in another city. The ID didn't match. They flagged it and called us. When I told Neil, he didn't believe it at first. They caught him? Almost, I said. He's under questioning. But don't expect him to stay quiet. Men like him always have stories ready. Neil nodded, his hands trembling slightly. I just want this over, Dad. It will be, I said, though part of me knew better. Some things don't end just because someone's caught. They end when lessons stick. A week later, we got official notice that Darius had confessed to trying to take the business and steal from multiple investors, including the attempt to access my account. He would face charges for fraud and attempted theft. That night, Neil came over for dinner for the first time in months. He ate quietly, not rushing, not checking his phone, not pretending. After we finished, he looked at me and said, I know now why you said you'd think about it. You weren't testing me with money, were you? You were testing who I'd become after losing it. I smiled faintly. Money can build or destroy, but character decides which. I just wanted to see which side you'd stand on. He nodded slowly. I almost failed that test. No, I said. You almost quit. But you didn't. That's the difference. Outside, the night was calm for once. No calls, no alarms, no warnings. Just a quiet peace that comes after a long fight. Neil still had debts to settle and a business to rebuild. But this time, he wasn't chasing quick success. He was building carefully, one honest step at a time. And me? I finally slept through the night. For the first time in years, I didn't dream about numbers or losses. I dreamed about something better. A son who'd finally learned that sometimes the hardest advice is the one never spoken. Weeks passed after the court hearing, but peace didn't return as easily as we hoped. The store had been cleared of all traces of Darius's involvement. The bank accounts were secure, and the lawyer assured us that the case was nearly closed. Yet even with everything falling back into place, something inside me stayed restless. I'd seen enough men like Darius to know that they didn't fade quietly into the background. They always left a mess behind, even when they were gone. Neil tried to move forward. He came to my house every weekend, always talking about the store and how he was restructuring everything from scratch. He showed me invoices, customer feedback, supplier agreements, every decision now backed by logic and caution. I could see he was trying to prove not only to me, but to himself that he had changed. Still, sometimes I'd catch him staring off mid-sentence, his expression uncertain, as if his confidence had been rebuilt, but not yet tested. One rainy afternoon, he arrived at my house with a folder under his arm and exhaustion in his eyes. "Dad, I've been doing everything right," he said, sitting heavily on the couch. "Cash flow's steady. Customers are happy, and the books balance perfectly. But it feels like something's missing." I closed the newspaper and looked at him. "What's missing?" He hesitated, then sighed. "I don't trust myself anymore. Every time a new opportunity comes up, I second-guess it. I keep hearing your voice in my head, reminding me what can go wrong." I smiled faintly. "Maybe that voice isn't a warning anymore. Maybe it's your conscience learning how to speak." He chuckled softly, rubbing his hands together. "It's strange, though. I used to think confidence came from success. Now I see it comes from surviving failure." That evening, after he left, I sat alone thinking about his words. He was learning in ways I never could have taught him directly. Experience had become his teacher, and pain had become the tuition he'd paid for it. But the peace didn't last long. The following week, a letter arrived at my doorstep. No return address, just my name written in neat black ink. Inside was a short message typed on plain paper. "The case isn't over. You took something that wasn't yours." My hands stiffened around the paper. It didn't take a genius to guess who sent it. I called the lawyer, who confirmed that Darius had been released on bail pending further trial. He wasn't in prison yet, and that meant he was free to stir trouble. That evening, I called Neil and told him to be careful. He sounded calmer than I expected. "I'm not afraid anymore," he said. "If he tries anything again, I'll handle it. I've learned enough." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were building toward one final test. Not for me, but for him. 2 nights later, it came. Neil called just after midnight. "Dad," he said, his voice low but steady. "He came to the store. Tried to convince me to drop the charges. Said he'd pay double the damages if I'd just let the past stay quiet." "What did you say?" I asked, holding my breath. "I told him no," Neil said, "and then I told him something else, that I forgave him." He looked confused. I said I wasn't forgiving him for his sake, but for mine, because I refused to carry his dirt any longer. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I felt something inside me ease, not pride, not relief, but peace. The kind that comes when you realize the person you've been trying to protect finally doesn't need protection anymore. The next day, Darius vanished again, but this time it didn't matter. The store ran smoothly, the accounts grew, and Neil carried himself like a man who had earned every ounce of his own redemption. One evening, he came over for dinner again, bringing a small envelope. He placed it on the table and said, "It's not the full amount yet, but it's the first repayment for what you sent me that night." I looked at the envelope and shook my head. "Keep it. That money wasn't a debt. It was a lesson." He smiled quietly. "Then think of this as gratitude." After he left, I sat there holding the envelope, realizing something simple but powerful. I had given him money to see what he'd do when he fell. Instead, I saw what he'd become when he stood back up. That night, I finally understood that sometimes the best lessons aren't about business or money at all. They're about faith, not the kind that waits for miracles, but the kind that believes in someone long enough for them to become their own. Months passed, and for the first time in years, life started moving quietly. The noise that used to follow us, the phone calls, the tension, the fear, had settled into something gentler. Neil's business grew slowly but steadily. He hired 2 workers, both young, both hungry to learn. He didn't chase flashy partnerships or quick profits anymore. Every decision went through his own filter. Will it last? That question had become his compass. He came to visit every Sunday, usually bringing groceries or coffee. We'd sit on the porch, the kind of quiet company that doesn't need filling. Sometimes he talked about business, sometimes about his regrets. But more often he spoke about how strange it felt to start over, to build from something small without trying to impress anyone. "I used to think success meant people looking up to me," he said one evening, watching the sky turn orange. "Now it's just peace of mind. I didn't even know that was part of the deal." I nodded slowly. "Peace doesn't sell well because people don't recognize it until they paid too much for it." He smiled, shaking his head. "You always talk like a man who's already lived 3 lifetimes. "Maybe I did," I said quietly, "and you're living one of them now." A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Neil was invited to speak at a small business seminar organized by the local community center. He wanted to decline at first. Public speaking had never been his strength, but I told him to go. "Not to impress them," I said, "but to remind yourself how far you've come." On the day of the event, I sat in the back row, watching him walk onto the stage. He looked nervous at first, adjusting the mic, clearing his throat. But once he started talking, the words came out naturally, honest, steady, with the kind of tone that comes only from experience that hurts. He told the audience about trust, pride, and loss. He didn't name names or dramatize it. He just spoke like a man telling the truth to people who needed to hear it. When he finished, the room went quiet for a moment before everyone started clapping. He looked toward the back of the hall and saw me. I didn't stand, didn't wave, but he smiled anyway. That small look between us said more than any applause ever could. After the event, as people gathered around him, a man approached me quietly. "You must be his father," he said. I nodded. "He spoke with honesty," the man added. "You raised him well." I gave a small smile. "No, life did." Over the next few months, Neil's store became a local favorite. People liked him not because he was charming, but because he was consistent. He treated customers fairly, listened more than he spoke, and owned his mistakes before anyone else could point them out. There was a strength in his humility now, one he never had when he thought he knew everything. One day he brought me to the store to show me something new. He had changed the sign again. The old name, Venture Tech Solutions, was gone. The new one read, Caldwell & Son Repairs. My throat tightened when I saw it. "I didn't ask you to do this," I said. "I know," he replied, "but it feels right. This business wouldn't exist without what you did for me." I looked at the sign again, the paint still fresh, the letters bold but simple. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest, like everything he'd finally become. After that, our lives found rhythm. Mornings were calm, evenings peaceful. But one night, something arrived in the mail that reminded me how quickly the past likes to visit. An envelope with no return address, thick and folded twice. Inside was a check for $10,000 and a note that read, "For what I took, I'm not asking forgiveness." It was signed shakily by Darius Kellen. I read it twice before setting it down. There was no satisfaction in it, no joy, just a strange, quiet understanding that even a man like Darius had reached the edge of his own mirror. I didn't cash the check. I placed it in a drawer next to a faded photo of Neil as a child holding his first broken radio, something he'd taken apart to fix. Funny how that same instinct had almost destroyed him, yet now it was what he used to make a living. That night, I wrote a note of my own and slipped it into that same drawer. Every man has two lives. The second one starts when he realizes the first was teaching him how to live. Months later, when Neil found that note after I was gone, I hoped he'd understand what I meant. That wisdom isn't about being right. It's about staying still long enough for truth to find you. And that the greatest gift a father can give isn't money or advice, but a chance for his son to fail, learn, and rise again as someone better than he was before. And that night, for the first time, I didn't worry whether he'd ever lose everything again, because I knew if he did, he'd know exactly how to rebuild, piece by piece, just like his old man once did. By the time a year had passed, life had become something quieter, something ordinary, and I found that I liked it that way. My days had settled into a rhythm I could trust. I woke early, made coffee, opened the curtains, and watched the light crawl over the hills behind my house. Neil visited often, but not because he needed advice anymore. He came because he wanted company, and that difference alone made every visit feel lighter. His store was thriving. What had started as a small repair shop was now a modest but respected business in town. He employed 5 workers and even started an apprenticeship program for young men who couldn't afford college but wanted to learn trade skills. Every Saturday I would drive by and see them laughing, arguing, and working together. Young hands learning how to turn effort into something solid. One afternoon, Neil invited me to the shop to see a new project. "Dad," he said with that familiar spark in his eyes, "we're expanding. I found a small warehouse 2 blocks away. I want to turn it into a training center." I raised an eyebrow. "Training center?" He grinned. "You always said real learning comes from making mistakes under supervision. I want to teach them what you taught me, how to build without cutting corners." That moment caught me off guard. I'd given him money once, and it nearly destroyed him. Now he was building something that could help others stand before they fell. It felt like life had closed a full circle, quietly and perfectly. We walked to the warehouse later that week. It was nothing glamorous. Cracked floors, rusty shelves, and dust in every corner. But Neil walked through it like a man seeing gold under the dirt. "It'll take time," he said, "but I'll make it work." I smiled. "You already did, son. You just haven't finished proving it to yourself yet." Over the next few months, I watched him pour his energy into that place. Every nail, every bolt, every dollar spent came from his own earnings. Sometimes, after work, he'd stop by my place, sit on the porch, and tell me about the progress. I could hear pride in his voice, not the kind that boasts, but the kind that breathes quietly. One night, as we sat outside under the dim porch light, he said something that made me realize how much he'd changed. "You know, when I lost everything, I thought failure was the end of my story. Now I think it was just the introduction." I chuckled softly. "Failure always writes the first chapter, son. Success only gets to write the last if you stick around long enough." He looked out into the dark, thoughtful. "Do you ever regret helping me back then? Sending that money?" I shook my head. "No, I didn't send it to fix you. I sent it to test you. Money just opened the door. You're the one who decided which way to walk." He smiled faintly. "Then I'm glad I walked the hard way." Weeks later, on a quiet Friday, the training center finally opened. The ribbon was a piece of electrical wire. His workers had tied it themselves as a joke. There was no grand ceremony, no photographers, just the people who mattered, standing shoulder to shoulder. When Neil handed me the scissors, I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You should be the one to cut it," he said. I looked at him for a long moment before replying, "No, son. This time, you do it. You built it. You earned this." He hesitated, then snipped the wire. Everyone clapped, and I could see the emotion in his eyes. It wasn't about the building. It was about the journey that had led him here. That night, after everyone left, Neil and I stayed behind. The place smelled of fresh paint and sawdust. He poured 2 cups of cheap coffee from a thermos and handed me one. "You know," he said, smiling faintly, "I think I finally understand what you meant when you said silence teaches louder than words." I looked at him, proud in a way that didn't need saying. "It does," I said, "because silence leaves room for the truth to echo." He nodded, then added softly, "And sometimes it echoes for a whole lifetime." As we sat there, I realized something else. The story that had started with a mistake and a stubborn son had turned into something stronger than either of us expected. I had once feared that my silence would push him away. Instead, it had brought him closer. The next morning, I woke to find a small note slipped under my door. It was from Neil. "Dad, I deposited your $100,000 back into your account. You once said money should move when lessons are learned. I think this one's done moving." I smiled as I folded the note. It wasn't about the money. It never was. But it felt good to know that the same boy who once told me he didn't need my advice had grown into a man who no longer needed my help, but still wanted my presence. And that, more than anything, was the kind of return no bank could measure. The return of that money marked something far deeper than a financial gesture. It was the final punctuation in a long story that had begun the day Neil told me, "I don't need your advice. I know business." I sat there at my kitchen table that morning, the letter in my hand trembling slightly, not from age but from the sheer weight of what those words now meant. I didn't rush to check my account. I didn't even need to. I believed him this time. Trust, once broken, doesn't repair with words or apologies. It rebuilds itself quietly through actions. And Neil's actions had spoken louder than every promise he had ever made. Still, a small part of me couldn't help but remember the long road that had led us here, the pride, the loss, the silence, the long nights waiting for calls that might never come. It all suddenly felt worth it. Later that day, Neil called. His voice carried that calm, mature tone that comes from standing in storms and learning how to breathe through them. "Dad," he said, "I know you'll tell me it wasn't about the money, but I needed to do this. It's my way of closing that chapter." I smiled to myself. "Chapters don't close, son. They just stop bleeding when you stop reopening them." He laughed softly. "You always have a way of saying things that sound simple but take a lifetime to understand." That evening, he invited me to dinner at his new house. It wasn't extravagant, just a neat, modest home with a small garden and a porch light that flickered slightly when you turned it on. He greeted me at the door wearing an apron, the smell of roasted chicken filling the air. "I thought it was time you sat at my table for a change," he said. It hit me then. This was the same boy who once thought family dinners were interruptions to his important online meetings. The same boy who'd once forgotten my birthday because he was busy chasing investors. Yet here he was now, setting the table with care, folding napkins, making sure every plate had a place. Growth doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like small gestures done quietly, with intent. We sat down to eat. The conversation drifted between business, memories, and a little bit of laughter. He told me stories about the young apprentices, how one of them accidentally short-circuited a whole workbench and nearly fainted thinking he'd ruined everything. I laughed, and for a moment I saw my younger self in his words, remembering how many mistakes I'd once made before life taught me balance. After dinner, he brought out an old photo album. "I found this in the storage," he said. The first picture was of him at 12, holding that broken radio he had tried to fix. I remembered how angry I had been when he tore it apart, But I also remembered his eyes, curious, full of questions. Maybe that was the same spark that had pushed him toward business, just without the wisdom to guide it back then. He flipped through the pages slowly, stopping at one photo of me and his mother, taken years ago in front of our first small workshop. The edges of the picture had turned yellow with time. He stared at it for a long moment. "I wish she could see this," he said softly. "She does," I replied, "just not the way we expect." There was silence after that, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that fills a room with meaning. Then, almost as if the thought had been weighing on him, Neil said, "You know, when I lost everything, it wasn't the money that broke me. It was realizing how little I respected what you tried to teach me. I thought I was smarter, faster, but I was just loud." I didn't interrupt him. He needed to say it out loud. Sometimes words, once spoken, free the weight they carry. "I used to think you were old-fashioned," he continued, "that you didn't understand how things work now. But the truth is, I didn't understand how people work, how trust and integrity can be more valuable than profit. Darius taught me that the hard way, but you let me learn it on my own, and I think that's what saved me." I looked at him and said quietly, "You were never lost, Neil. You were just walking through the fog. Everyone gets lost there once. What matters is who comes out still willing to walk." He smiled, his eyes glistening under the soft kitchen light. "You know, Dad," he said, "for a long time I was chasing freedom, but it's strange. Turns out real freedom comes when you stop running from responsibility. That's because responsibility doesn't trap you," I said. "It anchors you." The clock ticked softly as we sat there, father and son, the years between us folding neatly like pages of a book finally closed. When I stood to leave, Neil walked me to the door. "You're not walking home, are you?" he asked. "It's late. I'll drive you." I shook my head. "No, son, I walked enough miles in my life waiting for you to come back to this version of yourself. I can walk this last one home." He laughed, though his eyes said he understood. He hugged me before I stepped off the porch, a rare thing for him. It wasn't quick or hesitant. It was strong, the kind that holds gratitude more than words ever could. When I got home, I sat by the window, watching the night spill over the town. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, and in the distance I could see the faint glow of the sign outside Neil's store, Caldwell and Son Repairs. The name shone brighter than ever, not because of the light bulbs, but because of what it stood for now: redemption, perseverance, and a father's silent faith. I took out a small notebook I'd kept over the years, filled with reminders and lessons. At the bottom of the last page, I wrote one final line. "Sometimes love doesn't look like helping. Sometimes it looks like standing still and letting the people you love learn how to walk again." As I closed the notebook, I realized something else. Age hadn't taken my strength. It had only taught me when to use it. And in all those quiet moments where I thought I was losing my son, I was really just waiting for him to find himself. The house was silent, but it wasn't lonely. It was full of something else: peace, earned through patience, paid for with time, and sealed with understanding. And as I turned off the lights, one thought came softly, the way old wisdom always does. Sometimes the best advice a father can give is none at all, just the quiet faith that his son will one day understand why. The year that followed felt like the longest and calmest chapter of my life. It was as if time had finally decided to slow down so I could take a proper look at what it had built, or maybe what it had repaired. Neil's business, Caldwell and Son Repairs, had become more than a store. It had turned into something of a small institution in town. Local newspapers wrote about it once, calling it a quiet revolution of honesty in trade. Neil never mentioned the article to me, but I found a copy taped on the back wall of his office when I visited one afternoon. He had painted the inside of the shop a deep, soft gray. The smell of oil, solder, and warm metal hung in the air. Shelves were stacked neatly, and I could see handwritten notes pinned up beside work orders. Things like don't rush the fix and people pay for peace of mind, not speed. Those little reminders told me more about who he had become than any long speech ever could. That day, as I walked in, the bell above the door gave its usual tired jingle. Neil looked up from his desk and smiled. "Hey, Dad," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "Didn't expect you this early." "I figured I'd catch you before the rush," I said. "Besides, I wanted to see how the new recruits are doing." He gestured to the back, where 3 young men were working over a table cluttered with circuit boards and wires. They were arguing, not angrily, but the way people do when they care about getting something right. One of them looked over and nodded politely before turning back to his task. Neil followed my gaze. "They're good kids," he said. "Hard workers. A little too confident sometimes, but I guess that's how it starts." I chuckled softly. "Confidence without scars is just noise, son. Give them time. Life will sand the edges down." He smiled, and I could tell he understood. We went into his small office, where 2 mugs of coffee sat steaming on the table. He handed me one. "You know," he said after a pause, "I've been thinking about something lately. About that night when you sent me the money. I always thought of it as the turning point. But now I think the real change happened when you didn't say anything, when you let me figure it out." I took a slow sip, feeling the warmth settle in my chest. "Words are like tools," I said. "The right one at the wrong time can still break what you're trying to fix." He nodded. "That's true. I remember thinking back then that you were being cold. But now I get it. You were giving me a mirror, not a map." For a long time, we sat in silence, both of us listening to the faint hum of machines in the background. I thought about how different this silence felt from the ones we'd had before. The old silences used to feel heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. This one was different. It was peaceful, earned. It was the kind that comes when there's nothing left to prove. Later that afternoon, a customer came in, an elderly woman with a nervous smile and a broken floor fan in her hands. Neil greeted her warmly and promised to take a look. I watched him interact with her, patient and kind, explaining every step in simple words. When she left, he turned back to me. "That was Mrs. Yates. Comes in every few weeks just to chat, I think. Says the store reminds her of her late husband's workshop." "That's because it feels like one," I said. "A place where people know what they're doing and why it matters." He nodded, thoughtful. "Sometimes I think this shop saved me more than I saved it." That night I stayed for dinner again. We sat in the back room of the store, eating takeout on overturned crates, the air smelling faintly of metal and warm bread. Neil talked about expanding again, maybe opening another branch in the next town, maybe franchising someday. But he spoke differently now. The old excitement had been replaced with calm intention. "If it happens," he said, "it'll happen slowly. I'm done chasing fast things." I smiled. "Fast things burn quick, son. You're better off building something that lasts even when you're not around to see it." He looked at me for a moment, then said quietly, "You think I'll be ready for that? To leave something behind that lasts?" I met his eyes. "You already are." A few weeks later, I started noticing little changes in him. Not dramatic ones, just subtle shifts that only a father would catch. He was spending less time behind the counter and more time mentoring his workers. He was delegating, trusting, teaching. He'd become what I used to be years ago, a builder of people, not just things. One evening, he asked if I could come to the shop after hours. "There's something I want to show you," he said. When I arrived, the lights were dim except for the warm glow from the back. He had set up a small corner with framed photos, newspaper clippings, and an old toolbox. "What's all this?" I asked. He smiled. "I'm starting something new here. A small corner called the Lesson Bench. It's where we keep reminders of what we've learned. Not business tricks or repair notes, but the lessons that matter. Patience, accountability, respect. Stuff that can't be bought." He picked up the old toolbox. It was mine, the one I had used for nearly 30 years. "I kept this after you closed your old workshop," he said. Thought it was time to bring it back. You see, every apprentice who finishes their first year here will add one item to this box. A tool, a note, something that taught them something real. I didn't know what to say for a moment. My throat tightened, and I just nodded. That's a good idea, I managed to whisper. He laughed softly. It's more than that, Dad. It's proof that mistakes don't end us. They build us. As I stood there looking at that simple wooden box marked with years of scratches and dents, I realized what he had done. He had turned pain into something lasting. He had made meaning out of failure, and in doing so he had built something that neither money nor luck could ever buy. Legacy. Months rolled into another year. The lesson bench became part of the shop's identity. People in town talked about it. Parents bringing their teenagers there, schools arranging visits. Neil's story became a quiet example of resilience and humility. One evening, as we locked up the shop together, he looked at me and said, "You know, Dad, sometimes I still hear your voice when I make decisions." I smiled. That's good. Just make sure it argues with you once in a while. That's how you know you're still growing. He laughed, locking the door. You always have an answer for everything. Not everything, I said, looking up at the sign glowing softly above us. Just the things worth answering. When I went home that night, I sat by the window again, the same spot where I'd once watched the darkness thinking I'd lost my son. The town was quiet, the streets calm. I thought about how strange life is, how the same moments that nearly break us can become the ones that define us later. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, the same brand I'd kept for special occasions. And though there was no celebration, no milestone, it felt right. Because in that moment, I realized something simple yet profound. All the advice I'd ever wanted to give him had finally reached him, not through my words, but through his own living. I raised the glass toward the window, toward the faint light of the shop sign in the distance. To mistakes, I said quietly, the best teachers a man can ask for. Then I took a sip and smiled, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the story of a father and son had no unfinished lines left to write. Only the quiet, steady continuation of two lives that finally understood each other without needing to say a single word more. I used to think stories ended with grand moments, with applause, with trophies, or with some kind of dramatic closing scene where everything makes sense. But standing outside Caldwell and Sun Repairs one crisp autumn evening, I realized life doesn't really work that way. It ends quietly, like the soft click of a light turning off after a long day. Not because the story is over, but because peace doesn't need a spotlight. The leaves had begun to turn gold around the town, and the streets were full of that familiar hum of early evening, car engines, distant laughter, and the occasional bark of a restless dog. The sign above the shop glowed steady and warm. I stood there, leaning against my truck, watching through the glass, as Neil and his workers closed up for the night. They joked as they swept the floor, teased each other about who would lock up last. It was ordinary, but it was everything. When Neil finally came out, he locked the door and saw me waiting. "You didn't tell me you were stopping by," he said, smiling. "I didn't plan to," I replied, "just passing through." He chuckled. "You've been passing through this street every week since we opened." "Old habits," I said, smiling faintly. "They stick around when you've got nothing left to unlearn." He leaned against the wall beside me. "You know, I was thinking today about that first night. When you said you'd think about helping me, I thought it meant you didn't care. Now I see it was the first time you actually did." I nodded slowly. "Caring isn't always saying yes. Sometimes it's standing far enough away for someone to see what they're doing wrong." He grinned. "Guess I had to crash into the wall to realize you built it to stop me." We both laughed then, the kind of laugh that isn't loud but runs deep, the kind that cleans out years of misunderstanding. I could see the reflection of the sign light in his eyes. That small shop had become his compass, just as my old workshop had once been mine. After a few quiet moments, Neil said, "You remember that saying you used to have? The one about lessons? Which one?" "The one you wrote in your notebook. I found it when I was helping you clean out the attic. Every man has two lives. The second one starts when he realizes the first was teaching him how to live." I smiled softly. "I wrote that after your mother passed. It took me a long time to understand it." He looked at me and said, "I think I'm living my second one now." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of sawdust and the faint echo of laughter from the nearby diner. We didn't speak for a while after that. Words would have only disturbed what the silence was saying for us. A few weeks later, the town held its annual community fair. For the first time, Neil's business had its own booth. It wasn't a fancy setup, just a wooden table, some repaired tools, and a small sign that read, "Built to Last." He gave free workshops to kids who wanted to learn basic repairs. Watching him teach, I saw the same spark in his eyes that I once had when I started out. But there was something steadier in him now, something I never had at his age. Balance. Parents came up to thank him for helping their kids, and he'd smile, that humble smile, the one that said he wasn't chasing praise anymore. When a local reporter asked him how he built such a loyal community around his work, Neil said something that caught even me by surprise. He said, "My father taught me that you don't build a business, you build people. The rest just follows." It was strange hearing him say that because it wasn't something I'd ever told him out loud. It was something I'd only ever lived by. That night, when the fair ended and we were loading boxes into his truck, he turned to me and said, "You know, Dad, I used to think your silence was hard to understand. Now, I think it was your way of letting me hear my own thoughts." I smiled. "If you ever have a son, you'll understand it even better." He laughed. "Maybe I already do." There was a pause, and he added quietly, "You should come by tomorrow. I want you to see something." The next morning, I arrived at the shop before sunrise. The sky was painted in that soft blue light that only lasts a few minutes before day truly begins. The front door was unlocked, and when I stepped inside, I saw something new hanging on the wall above the lesson bench. It was a framed photograph, me and Neil standing in front of the shop the day he'd changed the name. Underneath, in simple lettering, it read, "This place was built from mistakes, fixed by patience, and held together by love." For a long time, I just stood there staring at it. The words weren't poetic. They were plain, honest, true. The same way we had both learned to live. Neil walked in a few minutes later, coffee in hand. "I thought it was time to give credit where it's due," he said. I shook my head. "That's your story now, son. You wrote it." He smiled softly. "Maybe. But you gave me the first page." We spent that morning talking like we hadn't in years. About her, about the early days, about everything that had led us here. The shop came alive around us, workers showing up one by one, the sound of drills and laughter filling the space. It didn't feel like just a business anymore. It felt like a heartbeat, steady, strong, alive. As I left that afternoon, I looked back once more at the shop and the people inside. I realized something I hadn't before: the money, the lessons, the mistakes. They had all led to this one truth. I hadn't just built a business or raised a son. I had built continuity, something that would outlive me not because of my name, but because of the values that name carried. On the drive home, I thought about how stories like ours don't end with explosions or drama. They end in the quiet passing of wisdom from one set of hands to another. They end with understanding, the kind that doesn't need to be said out loud anymore. When I got home, I sat by the window again, the same window where so many nights had once been filled with worry. Now the world outside looked calm. I could almost hear her voice again, his mother, whispering, "He found his way." And maybe, in that moment, I found mine too. I picked up my notebook one last time and wrote the final line on the last blank page. A man's success isn't measured by what he earns, but by what he leaves standing when he's gone. Then I closed it, feeling the peace that comes when every part of a story finally lands where it belongs. So if you've stayed with me till now, take this one thought with you. Every mistake, every failure, every painful silence in your life might just be preparing you for the version of yourself you were meant to become. Don't rush it. Don't force it. Let it build you, one lesson at a time. And if this story made you think of someone who once stood by you in silence, someone who believed in you when you didn't deserve it, call them. Tell them you understand now. That's worth more than any apology or gift you could ever give. If you like this story, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, what's the hardest lesson life ever taught you? And what did it help you build? Because sometimes it's not the wins that define us. It's the quiet rebuilding that happens after the fall, the kind that turns pride into purpose and failure into legacy.